Hello, I'm Dr. George Simon, and welcome to another edition of the new Character Matters program. This is a program where we talk about the defining issues of our time, namely the character crisis that we face and that we've been in for some time, and what we can do about it, how we can better understand it, how we can improve our relationships, and how we can all do better to grow emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, in character. Today's program continues a discussion that we've been having on narcissism. This is part two of a discussion about narcissistic personalities. And we're looking at the vast spectrum of not only character disturbance, but also the spectrum of narcissism. It wasn't that long ago that the powers that be that define the disorders that make it into the official compendium of mental and personality disorders was considering eliminating narcissistic personality disorder from an official classification. This upset a lot of people, outraged many, because as we know, narcissism is a defining issue of our time. So many relationships have been distressed, ruined in many cases, because of narcissism. But narcissism as a trait in one's personality is not the whole story. And just exactly what constitutes a narcissistic personality disorder has been the subject of considerable debate. You see, at one time, narcissistic behavior was considered fairly abnormal. Now, we're not talking about confidence or overconfidence. We're not talking about necessarily ego inflation, a high opinion of oneself. Narcissism is a degree of self-centeredness, a degree of ego inflation, and a degree of a sense of entitlement that gets in the way of healthy relationships. And it gets in the way of one's own character development and formation. It's an unhealthy degree of those things that make a person an undesirable character. And it used to be that such extreme manifestations of grandiosity, vanity, or any of the other features that we've commonly thought of as being part of narcissism were out of the ordinary. They're not so out of the ordinary anymore. There are many aspects of our culture that foster narcissism in one way or another, even reward it, reinforce it heavily, which is why we have so much more of it these days. And which is why it's also harder than ever to define a true disorder, because in years past, in many years past, and for many years, the official diagnostic criteria was that a person's style of relating, their personality, had to be so extreme in its manifestation, so out of the ordinary, or so deviant from the mainstream or from the normal, and so inflexible so as to impair the person's ability to function, either occupationally or within a relationship or in society in general. And the case is these days that many narcissistic styles of relating not only don't severely hamper a person's ability to function, but also serve to help the person get ahead and succeed in many ways. So folks don't have much motivation folks with these characteristics, they don't seem to have any incentive to change their way of approaching things or change their way of doing things. Matter of fact, they don't have the motivation to even think about such things because it all appears to be working for them. And so today I want to talk a little bit about some of the more benign forms of narcissism, those that would have a really hard time being considered a disorder. And I'm going to start with talking about one of the more benign. Of course, I don't believe that any kind of narcissism is healthy. Okay, and as I mentioned, I'm not talking about just confidence or high self-esteem. I'm talking about narcissism, which is excessive self-esteem, an inflated sense of self, overconfidence, and many other features. A lot of things tie into making a narcissist a narcissist. But one of the more benign narcissists is the charmer. Some theoreticians have called this kind of personality the amorous narcissist. This is the person who knows well how to win your heart. And their game is precisely that, to endear themselves to you because what they want is your endearment. They feed on you liking them. And there are lots of folks out there who know how to be charming, to seem unassuming, and to win you over. Now, these folks can appear quite loving because of the way in which they present themselves. But there's a difference between having the skill to cultivate endearment and affection, to win others' hearts. There's a difference between having the skills, the connection skills, to win somebody over and therefore be loved, be adulated, maybe even be adored. There's a difference between that and the willingness to love, which involves sacrifice, which involves genuine self-giving. So whereas true love is characterized by genuine self-giving, amorous narcissism is by definition self-serving. It's winning somebody's heart for the sake of the feeling that you get when you know that someone has been won over and will do anything for you and will make you feel good about yourself, even when maybe you don't quite really deserve it because you haven't really behaved that nobly. So I'm also going to be tying in this discussion with what I've been calling the 10 Commandments of Character. These are the axioms that form the basis of my upcoming new book, Provisions for the Journey, Embracing and Living the 10 Commandments of Character, a guide to emotional, psychological, behavioral, and spiritual health. So I'm going to be tying in some of the principles in those commandments. Last week, I talked about one of them, which is about overcoming our inherent egocentricity. So if you want to learn more about that, you can access the podcast, podcast number 2 in the current New Character Matters series. It's the first part on narcissism, but the second podcast. And so it's titled Narcissism Part 1. And you can avail yourself of the first commandment, which has to do with being aware, becoming aware of the bigger picture that is life, not only making yourself aware of it, but humbly recognizing that it's not all about us. It's not all about me, that there's a much bigger reality out there. And that bigger reality is responsible for my even being here. And so I'm inherently connected. I'm inherently connected to something much larger. And my very presence has impact. And the way I conduct myself has impact. And to be of good character, I have to be mindful of my impact in any situation, with any person, place, or thing. Everything I do impacts everything and everyone else in some way. Sometimes it doesn't seem so. Sometimes it seems like the impact is minuscule. But the fact is, everything I do has impact on the whole. We are all connected. Not in the same way that an infant sees it. The world is not an extension of us, and the world does not revolve around us. But each one of us, is connected to everything and everyone else. And how we relate, how mindfully, conscientiously, and especially how lovingly, truly lovingly we relate is what defines our character. So I want to quickly mention the other commandments that are involved pretty heavily in shaping up narcissistic characters. I mentioned the first one having to do with egocentricity. And the commandment, of course, to overcome that is to remember that you are not the center of the universe. Rather, you're one part of something much greater and more wondrous than you can possibly even imagine. The kind of humility necessary to temper future narcissism in a person's character development has to do with having that sense of awe and wonder about the grandness of this bigger picture. So you have to be mindful of how your urges and your desires, and most especially how your behavior impact everyone and everything else that exists. There are two other commandments that follow that also play big roles in the development of narcissistic personality styles. The second commandment has to do with our tendency, especially in modern culture, toward feelings of entitlement. And the second commandment goes like this: remember, you are not really entitled to anything. Your very life is an unearned gift. Therefore, strive to be grateful. Show your gratitude by honoring your obligations, thus meriting respect. I'll have much more to say about this commandment in a future program. As a matter of fact, there will be some programs on these very commandments, these commandments that are part of this book that I am finishing up, tentatively titled Provisions for the Journey. And here's the third that also factors very heavily into the development of narcissistic styles. And it has to do with getting the balance right with respect to one's self-esteem and self-respect. And there's a difference there, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. You are neither an insignificant speck, nor are you so precious or essential to the universe that it simply cannot do without you. So keep a balanced perspective on your sense of worth. Wow. I can't think of anything more crucial, especially in today's world. It's so hard for folks today to have a right head about them. And for so long, so much of popular psychology had it so egregiously wrong about self-esteem. We told people forever that you could never have too much self-esteem. And so we did all that we could to build children up and to make them feel good about themselves without really considering how to legitimately earn the kind of positive feelings toward oneself that we would ideally like people to have. We also made the most egregious mistake of telling people that whenever we saw inflation of someone's ego, whenever we saw someone acting all that, exhibiting braggadocio or acting haughty, we assumed that that presentation was a false presentation, that underneath it all, the person was struggling with feelings of insecurity and feelings of low self-worth, and were therefore trying to prove themselves. So they inwardly felt one way and they were trying to prove themselves. Now, that can sometimes be true, but in today's character disordered society, it is not true most of the time. And so therefore, a lot of what we told people and that hooked them into problem relationships, they got involved with characters who had this ego inflation, and they made the assumption that underneath it all, these were insecure people just needing a lot of love and affirmation. And boy, did they find out later on in the relationship how incorrect this was. Only after they'd been used and abused. So these three commandments that I've been talking about, they really play into the formation of narcissistic characters. And I thought I'd just mention them as a backdrop because I'm going to be talking about issues relating to them as I'm talking about the spectrum of narcissistic characters. And of course, on this program, I mentioned that I would be talking primarily about one of the more benign types of narcissistic characters, the charmer, the amorous type. The person who appears to know how to love, but is not really a lover, but rather a love seeker. And there's a big difference. There's a big difference between having the knack for currying favor and having the skill to be likable, to be amiable, and to be genuinely caring. To be genuinely self-sacrificing, self-giving, to genuinely love without expectation of return. There's a big difference. And many times on the front end of a relationship, folks don't understand this. So they allow themselves to be charmed. I'll just give a few qualities of this type of narcissist. This relatively benign, as I mentioned. This is probably the least dangerous kind of narcissist. But these folks who just have the gift, they have the skills. They've honed down the skills to be amiable, to be likable, and they're great. They are great at what we call the ego massage. In other words, when you encounter them, they have the knack for knowing what it is you need in the way of personal affirmation, and they are more than happy to build you up as a seductive ploy to get you basically to win your heart. So they know just what to say and do to make you feel good about you. Now, how sincere that is a whole different story. And what their objective is also a different story. Many times with the amorous narcissist, the point is not to love you. The point is to seduce you into loving them. There's a big difference. I'll repeat that. For the amorous narcissist, the point is not to love you, to truly love you. The point is, especially through the use of ego massage, the point is to seduce you into loving or adulating or affirming them. That's the name of the game. And it's never really healthy within a relationship. It can temporarily be actually something that a person needs. For example, a person could be so deficient in their own sense of self-worth that they can actually use a little building up. But these days you have to be careful, because just because someone is willing to do that doesn't mean they don't have their own hidden agenda. And that doesn't mean that necessarily the relationship is going to be healthy or go where it eventually needs to go if it's to be truly mutually respectful. And here's another point I'd like to make about the ego massage expert. Many times in these kinds of relationships, when someone gets seduced by an effective charmer or ego massager, a person who has these relatively speaking, benign narcissistic qualities in their character. Many times you'll find yourself finding a lot of common ground. You'll think, oh my goodness, we share so many likes and dislikes in common. We think alike. We enjoy the same things. And what can masquerade as that many times is, and what can masquerade as regard for you, is that the relatively narcissistic person sees in you themselves. And because the narcissist can only really love themselves, because they don't really have the capacity, not the mature, evolved capacity to really regard you, sacrifice for you, put their life on the line for you. What they're really responding to is the beauty of themselves that they see in you. You remind them of them. And of course, the narcissist, yes, if you remember the story of Narcissus looking in the pool of water and seeing the reflection, what they're really responding to is the them that they see in you. So you feel flattered and you feel like you found common ground, but in fact, they have found themselves again in you, and they like what they see because they like them. And so it seems like you've found some common ground when in fact, and it seems like you have found an opportunity for mutual regard, when in fact, the person is just still, as always, enamored with themselves, even if they see something in you that reminds them of themselves. So they will stroke you and they will adulate you just as they would themselves. And knowing full well that you'll come right back at them, that you'll come right back at them. Really loving, if it were easy as pie, would be something everyone would do. This is not a loving world. Folks of a certain faith persuasion believe that they have been commanded authoritatively to love, not suggested, not urged, but commanded. If something were easy and so natural to do, why would you have to command it? Loving is not easy, especially in this broken world. It requires self-sacrifice. Why do it? Because it's what we're here for. This is the spiritual dimension. This is the spiritual dimension of character that is so critical and so forgotten these days. We're here to grow in our capacity to love. Along the way, we have many experiences and challenges. We enter a very hostile place, a place that sometimes encourages us, where we sometimes find pleasure, where we sometimes find a meeting of our needs, or what appears to be a meeting of our needs. And for a minute, the anxiety that accompanies life abates and we feel safe. But that is not the majority of life. And the real challenge in life is to keep our hearts open, even in the face of the inevitable disappointments and slings and arrows that we're likely to face. The real challenge is to love in an unloving environment. And in so doing, grow ourselves positively. And to the extent that we can, bring some healing to this troubled, unloving, hostile, at times, broken world. To make things better. To further the evolutionary process. To keep us all growing. That's the real challenge. So if there were anything to really contemplate about the matters that I've been discussing on this program, it is to be careful of what looks like love. Because true regard is self-giving, self-sacrificing, selfless. It's not expectational. It's free. It's a gift. It doesn't expect anything in return. And it's seeking only to give. I hope you'll tune in for another episode of the New Character Matters. We're going to continue our discussion on narcissism. We're going to begin a discussion of some of the less benign types of narcissists that are far more frequent today than they ever used to be. How they really get that way, we're going to dispel some of the notions about why and how people develop the interaction styles that they do, and what to look out for so that you don't end up in a relationship that only stunts your emotional, psychological, and spiritual growth and only causes unnecessary as opposed to constructive pain that damages instead of grows and heals. Most people these days take multiple relationships and multiple marriages to finally discern what it takes to have a really mutually positively regarding, growth-oriented relationship with another human being. So I hope you'll join me for another edition of the New Character Matters. Check us out at drgeorgesimon.com. That's drgeorgesimon.com or manipulative-people.com. Either URL will take you to the website. You'll find all the archives for the New Character Matters podcasts there. Also check out the YouTube channel for Dr. George Simon. And there'll be a sub-channel for Character Matters very soon. You'll be able to access all the podcasts there as well. And stay tuned for more information about my forthcoming book, Provisions for the Journey, Embracing and Living the 10 Commandments of Character, Your Guide to Spiritual, Psychological, and Emotional Health. And thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. George Simon. See you next time.